So the question is, how well does it actually work? Can you give us an example? Do you have like all kinds of random things that don't make any sense, or does it actually help you a lot in your reading? Can you give us an example?
Okay, so I don't have any quantitative measure of how well it works. It's all qualitative. It's because I don't really have any measure of goodness or fitness of these clusters.
It's really hard, because it's like a UI issue and such. But
well, it's much deeper than that, right? It's really a semantic issue at heart.
True, but how often do you run into misclassified stories that are very obviously misclassified to you and such?
Most of the time. I mean, most of the time, honestly. So what's funny is that, like in the Eric Rudolph bombing thing, right? In that cluster, there are actually a couple of articles about a bomb that exploded in Iraq. And so that's obviously a misplacement, but it's obviously about a bomb as well. And if, for example, somebody had said, that this comedian bombed tonight, that also would have been grouped in there as well. Right? Again, way off topic. So I guess it is a pretty gross hack in a lot of ways, but for the most part it works because you're looking at I'm more or less quickly looking over the dominant set of data there as compared to, say, the true nature of the clusters. I'll explain a little bit of some of the other things that can go on there as well, but more or less comparing it then to Google News or comparing it to Topics, for example, which are two other sites that actually do news aggregation and clustering and grouping, I should say. They're much better at it than I am for a variety of reasons, including much better algorithms, but also maybe 100 times more sources than I've got here. But there's a consequence to that as well, which I'll explain in a little bit. Larry?
What do you do grouping by single words rather than word pairs or triplets?
Diagrams and trigrams? So I'm not, I should, right? That'd be fantastic to be able to do it that way. Like, for example, like White House, right, would obviously stand out just fine. Or President Bush would also stand out just fine, as opposed to President or whatever. But I basically never implemented it. That's kind of what it comes down to. It's a shame that I haven't as well, because I think that would improve the accuracy somewhat for a number of topics. Sierra Leone, for example, or the Dominican Republic, things like that would kind of stand out a little more strongly as well. But I just never did it. Never figured out a cheap way to do it, if you will. I mean, and this is all about totally being cheap. This is something like the core algorithm itself is something like, so Porter's summary is like 200 lines of Python. I think that the whole thing is basically like maybe another 100 lines of Python around that. So I'm all about the cheap, and I wrote this like at 2 a.m. one morning. So it worked well enough. Diagrams and trigrams would definitely improve it a lot as well. But there's other things I think that I could, as long as I'm going to go there, I may as well probably go another mile and kind of look at true natural language processing. We're looking at, for example, the appearance of nouns and verbs, but also classes of nouns and verbs, for example, that appear together, and trying to find distances between them, if you will. So, for example, Eric Rudolph always appears near the word bomb, right? So therefore, find things that cover the three of those things, not just the term bomb, but also find things that might cover Rudolph as well, right? But then you get some issues like first name, last name, and things like that. Also, my method doesn't deal with truncations. So if somebody, or abbreviations, I should say. So if somebody actually said, for example, U.S. Rep, whoever, I don't actually expand that out then to United States House Representative, member, et cetera, kind of thing like that. So it has a lot of hackish shortcomings, unfortunately. But diagrams and trigrams have definitely been in my mind. I just never figured out a fast way to do it. So getting into other good things out of this, right, that I've kind of worked up. So one of the funny things you can do, so this is all first order analysis, if you will, and kind of the current corpus of news data. And so the other interesting things you can do are second order analysis on this. So I've got news data that spans about 2 years at this point. And one of the things I got curious about is kind of the appearance of data over time, kind of the trends over time. During the presidential election and kind of the run-up, if you will, the presidential election last year, I got really curious to find out if some of the negative press that was appearing about the job situation, the failure to create a high number of jobs, was actually going to have a negative impact, if you will, on kind of the visibility of President Bush, and potentially, and kind of look at, if these two are linked, if you will. And it turns out that they're not very, very linked at all. In fact, jobs didn't get nearly as much mention as President Bush, thanks to the variety of reasons. But ultimately, what this kind of thing shows me is that it doesn't quite have the true linkage analysis that I was really hoping for, which I'll explain in just a second, but it does kind of give other kind of indicators that you can look at as well. So one of the other things I do in my job is actually a lot of marketing analysis these days. And so one of the things that I took upon myself to do was to kind of analyze press visibility of the Democratic and Republican tickets and to find out, for example, was there enough traction going on? Were they getting enough traction? Were they getting a message out very effectively? And what's interesting is that you can kind of pick out some interesting features based upon this graph here. So in red and green are Bush and Kerry. And as you'd expect, being the headliners in the tickets are actually appearing much more frequently than Cheney and Edwards here in blue and purple. And the interesting things that kind of pop out of here are, for example, the Democratic convention, when Edwards is picked, Edwards dropping out of the race right before the convention. A few weeks later, then you have the actual Republican convention and stuff like that. And then you actually have the VP debates down here as well. Things like this kind of pop out. And what's interesting is that I was actually able to look at this, and a few months even before they started talking about it, notice that there was simply a failure to get consistent traction in the press based upon looking at maybe 60 different sources of news, and primary sources at that, kind of finding out, for example, that the Kerry Edwards team just failed to kind of get their message out repeatedly. And also, then there's also a bully pulpit effect from the White House, right? If the White House sneezes, it's news, right? So obviously, you've kind of got this whole gaggle of reporters that are interested in whatever you do, and so you can say whatever you want, and you get much more visibility that way. That's also apparent here as well. Now on to some of the other caveats here, which are kind of larger sweeping caveats. You guys have identified a couple of them as well. One of the really big shortcomings of it is a failure to kind of work across languages. So here I've got French, Spanish, and English, all about the Charles and Camilla wedding. And you can see that it might kind of work for Camilla. It doesn't work for Charles because, well, Charles, Carlos, and Charles. But ultimately, this is really one of the big breakdowns of the system, is it only works for one language. So if I'd worked in French, I could probably find enough French sources and do it there. I chose English because it's what I know best. But unfortunately, I can't, for example, bring in Le Monde. I can't bring in a few other things I would love to be reading as well, like The Star and things like that. And El País, some of my favorite newspapers from around the world in kind of different perspectives, because they simply don't group into this very, very well. The other thing about this is, even if it's in English, if the writers are using, for example, different terminology to express what's going on, then it has difficulty in identifying what's really going on there. So, for example, the Atlantic or the New Yorker might actually write about, Social Security and say, now is the winter of our discontent, and that would be the headline of the story, and some sort of flowery language that introduces, if you will, the story. But it takes a while to kind of get down into describing that it's about Social Security, for example. But here, because we're only looking at kind of well-structured, commonly structured headlines and news bodies, we don't really necessarily identify it with that because it looks so much different. It looks like more like literature than it does than a news story. This works so well for news, and unlike blogs, for example, because daily newspapers have a very, very consistent format of how they actually express stories and headlines as well. And it's really driven by that feature, that it's a very rigid style because, well, it's not so much it's enforced, it's just that it's effective. And so, again, the language thing doesn't simply cut across languages, it really cuts within the language as well. The second thing is kind of a common thing you're always going to find kind of with a power law relationship. So hopefully you guys are familiar with power law relationships. That's kind of what's shown here as well. But basically, you have frequencies and number of occurrences here. And the dashed line represents more or less what we find clusters together, which is to say a very, very small number of things. It's actually this very, very heavy tail that bites us in the ass with this method as well. So you guys were asking about the number of clusters and the quality of them. They actually do trickle out and kind of get smaller as time goes on. But what's really unfortunate is some of the more interesting things that, for example, might be a special report in, say, the LA Times, don't necessarily bubble up because it's only them writing about it, right? So a thing that you may actually want to read doesn't necessarily bubble up, doesn't group into this because it's not really a topic that anyone else is talking about. It really drives on the fact that it's a frequently occurring topic in a lot of different newspapers, a lot of different sources as well. And so the heavy tail problem here really kind of, like I said, bites us in the ass. And so I actually have to walk around like, on Sunday mornings, typically over a cup of coffee, actually reading different newspapers to find the interesting stories there. Rick?
Your system, do those all at the end, do they get clustered anyway, even though they're not related, or do they all come up with separate stories?
So I actually don't even show them.
Oh,
Yeah.
I was thinking if you cluster those, you get a lot of the clusters, and there's kind of a linearization of the power law.
Right. That might actually be a way to do it, but I actually don't show them only because the clutter on the page would just be so great. I should look at doing it, though, because then I can, on one page, kind of find the interesting stories, if you will.
Yeah, but it'd be nice, because those are the ones that I usually am most interested in. Most of the stuff like Charles and Camilla, I could care less about.
Charles and Camilla, I could definitely care less about. But for example, you know,
Making that like
but for example, a summary of Alan Greenspan's testimony before Congress is very interesting to me. And you want to look at maybe 2 or 3 different views on that. But ultimately, you know, yeah, the really interesting stuff down at the bottom. I should probably look at doing that, but I just want to reduce the load time also for the page as well. So it's got a kind of it's this huge amount of clutter. Even though the frequencies aren't necessarily high, the volume of the heavy tail actually well overwhelms actually the head of it. And finally, kind of the echo chamber effect. This is like the best thing I come up with for an echo chamber at 2 o'clock in the morning. Actually, is one of the things I wanted to talk about in terms with respect to Google News and topics as well. Google, if you notice, they, for example, will not just cluster AP and UPI, for example, they'll also cluster how it's reprinted across hundreds of different sites. And this has basically the echo chamber effect as well. So if a very high-profile news source, in this case the AP, gets a story out and it's picked up by 100 different affiliates, it's magnified that much more. And so it begins to dominate kind of the news view, and you kind of lose, if you will, the interesting nature of it because it's artificially inflated. And that's the unfortunate, I think, effect of that as well. And so this is why I've stuck as much as possible in my methods. And I encourage you, if you're looking at this kind of thing, to stick as much as possible to those primary sources. Find the AP, basically find the original writers and syndicate their content and hold on to that, because then you really don't suffer from, you have a different echo chamber effect, which is to say, everyone talking about the same stories, but they're talking about it differently. And that's kind of what we're after here, is kind of those different perspectives on world events. I'm going to wrap up my talk now. I want to point out a few other things that are somewhat interesting here as well. Classifier for J is one of those Java libraries that actually does a little bit of classification. This is, like I said, this is all written in Python, but there are some people looking at it. One of the things that it does is does some semantic indexing and can actually determine, for example, based upon some semantic markup and semantic discovery, things that are interesting across boundaries. And that might actually work for very low volume corpuses, for example, in this case. But it also has Bayesian methods built in. So again, one of the caveats with that is you have to train it beforehand, kind of the things that you're interested in, the bodies that you're interested in. And RSS Bayes is just a raw implementation of a Bayesian filter rather against RSS as opposed to mail or some other body of text. Down at the bottom here, I have a few other things that are really interesting as well and kind of driving this for me as well. Scatter-gather is a very interesting technique for analyzing large amounts of data by basically looking across various bodies within that and kind of pulling together the things that are very, very interesting. There's actually an implementation, again, in Python that's very interesting, and I might actually look at rolling it in to see if it has anything that can actually benefit me. Newsburst is a thing from CNET, which actually does kind of this, which actually does this kind of clustering and grouping and lumping, if you will, on kind of a smaller basis in the tech world. Again, very interesting. CNET actually goes out, finds the hot topics in the industry and kind of groups them together. And finally, the open text summarizer really uses more or less kind of the same methods, it turns out, that I'm using as well, by basically breaking down, removing stop words, stemming, and finding the interesting things actually within a single story, and finding the 1 or 2 sentences that really summarize a large story, for example. That way, again, very, very useful way to look at lots of information very quickly. But it only works in one document. I actually work across documents with this as well. And that's it. So I encourage you to kind of look at things like this for kind of dealing with large amounts of data and large amounts of signal, whether it be IDS alerts like I was originally interested in, whether it be RSS and news and things like that. One of the other things I think that I should note about it is if you run this, for example, across the 100 or even 1,000 blogs that you might read, finding, for example, the meme or the interesting things that people are talking about across it is very, very difficult to do because people are talking about thousands of different things. The press is, of course, paid to write about the interesting stuff and get their perspective on it. So that's why it works very well there. If you look at, for example, blog decks or pop decks, they're looking at tens of thousands of blogs, hundreds of thousands of blogs, in fact,